Well, welcome everyone to DisrupTV, our 4th episode, and we have an incredible show today. And I'm here with my incredible co-host, author, CEO, founder of Constellation Research, HBR blogger, Ray Wang. How are you, Ray?
I'm doing great. How are you doing, Vala? What's going on?
I'm doing great. I want to jump into the show because we have 3 incredible segments, and we're leading with Dr. David Bray, who is the most social CIO in the world, named by many different sources. And he is one of the most innovative thought leaders and technologists, futurists, CIOs in the world, in my opinion, and again, many others. So with that, hello, David, and welcome to DisrupTV.
Hello, Vala. Hello, Ray. Great to be here. Actually, I was going to say, in honor of joining you, I was going to take off my tie so we can do it West Coast. In DC, you have to wear camouflage. I wear this camouflage for my meetings here, but I'll take off the tie for the conversation, and glad to join in and have some fun discussions about how the world is changing and how we must change with it.
He's anti-establishment.
Well, I want to retain my security clearance, so.
All right, we'll keep a security clearance.
This may be the first time I've seen Dr. David Bray without a tie, but for those of you watching, follow us on Twitter at DisrupTV Show, and follow the conversation with #DisrupTV so that we can take your questions and engage with our extraordinary guests, and we'll follow back with you if we are unable to answer questions during the show. So, Dr. David Bray, I'm going to start calling you David for the show. David, talk to us a little bit about your background, the fact that the Eisenhower Fellowship program. I know you've traveled maybe as much as Ray Wang, although that's a tall order, in the last 12 months into extraordinary parts of the globe, where you've been able to share your experiences transforming IT and also coming back with incredible insights.
Yes, so in the last 12 months, I've had the opportunity of being both the FCC CIO, and this is very interesting times at the FCC. When I arrived about 2 years ago, we had everything on-premise, unfortunately. We had 207 different systems. The average age of those systems were more than 10 years old, and they were consuming more than 85% of our IT budget just to maintain them. And as of this Labor Day weekend, we literally powered off everything else that was remaining at the FCC. We're able to basically do what we called Operation Server Lift. We loaded up 7 trucks, very large trucks, 400 terabytes of data, and moved it either straight to a cloud provider or a commercial service provider, such that there's now nothing on premise at the FCC. And we've managed to reduce our budget spend from being 85% of our budget to now then less than 50%. And so as a result, we've retired hundreds of servers. We're, 35% savings as a result overall in our budget. That's massive. And so that's really galvanized the team for those remaining systems that can't go straight to a cloud platform. Actually, we just had a leadership meeting last week where we decided we're not going to have what we called engineering and enterprise architecture in the future. Instead, we're going to call it cloud integration and catalog, because the reality is everything we do should reuse an existing commercial cloud platform and then build a service catalog of how we're going to reuse those components across the enterprise.
Wow, that's pretty incredible. So a lot of government agencies are probably going through that same battle, but just to make that decision requires a lot of change management, requires a lot of leadership. I mean, what did you do to actually bring all those pieces together? That's not an easy task.
Yeah, it was a fun one. It was a mission impossible in sorts of respects. The average person had been at the FCC for 15 and a half years. The average contractor had been at the FCC for 19 years. And so we were going to do this with existing staff, existing contractors. We brought in a few, but we didn't have like a wholesale change. And so really my job as a leader was, one, how to empower everyone to be a part of solving the problem. I talk about change agents, and change agents are creative problem solvers. And I said I was going to give you autonomy, I was going to give you measurable progress, and most importantly, a meaningful purpose. But ideally what I was going to embody over the year leading up to this massive effort was rewarding those people that were creative problem solvers. And we had some resistors. In fact, when I first jumped in, I probably had 15% that were on board. I probably had 50% that were waiting on the sideline. There had been 9 CIOs in 8 years, so they were probably just waiting me out.
Yes.
And then there was another like 35, 40% that actually wanted to go back to the way things were back in the 1990s, which clearly was not a solution. And so it took me crafting narratives, rewarding those that were doing good, as well as working with those that were more of the sort of stay behind laggards. And 4 months in, we were at 15%. 8 months in, we had grown to being about 35% were gung-ho. A year in, we had actually passed the tipping point of 50%. And most recently, we're now at about 80% are wholesale sold in as change agents. But that was cultural change. And in fact, one of them said it was a lot like Thanksgiving. And I said, well, tell me more. And they said it's like Thanksgiving in the sense that you've got everybody gathered, everyone's excited. It's your family is gathered together. They're still a dysfunctional family by no means of the imagination. They're all on their best behavior and they're hopeful about the future. And so I think that to me is a sign of success when you've changed that culture. Not only was it the Operation Server lift, but we've actually re-galvanized an agency that was feeling kind of down in the dumps and kind of depressed.
Ray, when I think of Thanksgiving, it's my favorite holiday. No gifts, football, and food. So, you know, it's my favorite holiday. But David, you know, first of all, you threw a lot at us, extraordinary achievements in such a short period of time. And you immediately transitioned the discussion from technology talk to culture, people, process, empowerment, servant leadership. Tell us a little bit about the Eisenhower Fellowship Program and whether you learned some of these leadership traits and attributes and success factors based on the program.
Yeah, so I was fortunate to also be selected last year to be an Eisenhower Fellow, and the Eisenhower Fellow program has been around since the 1950s. It's meant to be a mid-career fellowship, so I highly recommend people take a look at it. It's nonpartisan, and basically you pick up to 2 countries of your choosing to spend 5 weeks there. And in these 2 countries of your choosing, you're allowed to meet with, and actually they actually help you meet with people from both private sector and public sector. I mean, I met with CEOs of several of the large companies in Taiwan and Australia, as well as their heads of state. I actually had an opportunity to have an hour-long discussion followed by a weekend lunch with Malcolm Turnbull. At the time, he was the Minister for Communications. He's now the Prime Minister of Australia. And we had some fun conversations about encryption, how you're actually going to address the changing world, how you're actually going to address the fact that globalization is actually challenging the traditional notion of what it means to be a nation state, and how is the private sector and the public sector going to help us adapt to that.
Wow. And as you take those lessons learned, you're also sharing as well. I mean, when you look at some of the mission that's going on with the Eisenhower Fellows, I mean, they've basically been creating this kind of cross-border, inter-country, interdisciplinary kind of relationships. What should people look for when they try to apply for the fellowship?
Yeah, so I think first and foremost, think about how you're going to actually act locally, but also think globally. I mean, I know that's sort of a better catchphrase, but it's at the end of the day, all our actions at a local level build up to what actually is global change. So what you are doing, Ray and Vala, what we're doing in terms of conversations on social media, I'm a firm believer that there's these network effects that each of us, by doing our own part locally, lead to a global contribution. And I think sometimes when we look at the world and we see all the different challenges and all the different concerns, they can seem daunting. But when you actually think about what you can do, think about how you can actually sort of galvanize with scale, something that's meaningful and impactful. And then actually from that, from the conversations you have as an Eisenhower Fellow, share them. As you know, that's partly how I got the reputation of being the most social CIO, is I was sharing what I was seeing both in Taiwan and Australia about things about the Internet of Everything. Taiwan's concerns about cybersecurity. The fact is it may not be baked into the Internet of Everything. How can we support that? Australia's more concerns were about the fact that our privacy settings right now are co-located on the same platforms where we store our data. And maybe we need to think about actually teasing that out so that our privacy settings are separate from where we store data, which gives us more freedom of choice. And so conversations like this, I think, are important because so often in our exponential era, we're dealing with the here and now, which is good. We have to deal with the here and now. But if we don't think about where we're going to be in 2 years or 3 years, we run the risk of actually sort of running into a hard wall, and ending a dead end is where we want to go in terms of societies and technology without thinking about the future.
Absolutely. Well, another incredible social executive who's watching now is Phil Cremani, Chief Technology Officer at University of Texas Systems. And both you and Phil have talked in the past about you either disrupt or you get disrupted. But that's hard. Getting people with 20-year, tenure in IT, customizing and accumulating technical debt based on, legacy system support. You have transformed that thinking and you're now a cloud-first CIO. I know the transformational efforts that Phil went through doing some of the similar work, but give advice to CIOs that are watching. Where do you start? How do you get the team to really understand that if you're not mobile, if you're not social, if you're not data-driven, if you're not, empowered by the cloud, you really will over time lose credibility and relevance?
Yes, so I think it's very key. Anyone who's actually a CIO, I can hear Ray's ringtone. Anyone who's a CIO needs to actually think about that your job description is much more than what's on paper. If you actually only do what it actually describes what you're supposed to be doing as a CIO, you're going to fall behind. You actually have to exceed expectations. And so I think actually the interesting thing about CIOs now is we actually need to break past the paradigm of what we were in the 1990s, which is we were seen about being efficient and actually helping the organization be more efficient. First and foremost, I think we actually need to be thinking about how we make the organization more agile and adaptive. And then second, how more resilient. And third, finally, more efficient. And that's the conversations that you need to have with both your team, but also with your stakeholders, both internally and externally, which is, are we moving fast enough? Are we adaptive enough? Are we resilient enough? And if not, what does that mean for our private sector organization or our public sector organization? Are we dead in the water? And so once you have that conversation, now you've created this sense of urgency. The next thing is you have to link it to people's passions. And so one of the things I love to do as a sort of technique when I first meet with people is say, what brings you joy? And that's something that sometimes is an odd question for a CIO to be asking, but I think it's natural for a leader to be asking. Because if you ask what brings them joy, you figure out what they're talented and passionate about. It might be that they were used to be talented and passionate about either mainframes or client server. And you can say, well, can I help you find some joy instead with going to the cloud, doing cloud platform integration, thinking about how we do tailored platforms, but we're not writing code anymore because writing code becomes expensive and actually hard to maintain unless we really have to do it as our secret sauce. And so really as a CIO, I think it's really about thinking of your job as 80 to 90% people. I'm actually encouraged because there's actually some early reports that say in the last year and a half, more and more CEOs are actually having some experience being a CIO before they become a CEO, which definitely wasn't the case a decade ago. A decade ago, you didn't really see the CIOs become CEOs. The fact that that's changing, I think it really puts down the table stakes that says, if you accept a role as a CIO, definitely go beyond your job description, be a leader, and think about how you make your organization, whether it's private sector or public sector, be more agile, be more resilient, and more efficient along the way.
You know, that's a great point, because that cultural piece starts with how you work with people. And for you to actually go from a legacy IT shop to a pretty modern IT shop in 2.5 years, no technology can solve that, right? I mean, that's one of the pieces where we've been looking to see, you know, what kind of pieces of change and how kind of create those change agents. Tell us more about how you empower change agents in a change-resistant environment, because that's not an easy thing to do. And everyone who knows that they've been in a change situation, I mean, if you were only at, well, you're like 15% that believed at the beginning, that's right. Not an easy number to overcome.
Yeah, it's actually fairly daunting when you first pop into those circumstances, especially when you realize there have been 9 CIOs in 8 years before me. It could have been very easy to say the situation is hopeless and give up. But I think the way you actually empower change agents is you first find that sort of small minority that are the coalition of the willing, the people that want to create change, and then create spaces for them to actually come together, whether they're in your team or they're across the different teams. One of the things I did was on my own dime, I would pay for coffee and donuts and breakfast snacks and say, between the hours of 8 and 10, if you want to stop by, I'm here, have a snack, let's chat about how things are changing and what we can do. Similarly, outside of work, every once in a while, I organize what I call creative brainstorms. They're not attribution settings, they're happy hours. And it really is just to bring together these change agents, not just within the FCC. I'm a big believer, actually, we need to now have change agents, not only across government, but also with the private sector, because all of these issues, they don't fit into any one organization. And when people talk about the fact that the federal government is fragmented, they don't realize that that actually is partly by design. We wanted the fragmentation to be checks and balances, and that's well and good. But if we can't move at the speed we need to in the exponential era, we need to think much more about a network-based approach. And so with change agents, tell them, go ahead, go Ray.
Yeah, no, tell people about that networking that you do on a monthly basis. I think it's been going on for quite some time.
Yeah, it's been going on since 6 years ago when I first became a senior executive, when I joined the intelligence community and later Department of Defense. When you're banging your head against the wall as a change agent, it's nice to know you're not the only one. And so that's partly why we organize these sort of creative brainstorms. And they're really just a safe space, non-attribution, informal, where people can sort of self-organize. We've actually had 2 cases where different startups later formed as a result of people's conversations at these venues. We've actually had some people get married as a result too. So they're actually apparently like finding it's both personal and professional.
Better than Match.com. Hang out at Circle Bistro. No, just kidding.
Well, in the age of digital, sometimes face-to-face is still very much a priority, and I think it's sometimes key. And so, but I think if you think about it, I mean, the way we actually were able to actually create the great American experiment, and what the founders did, is they were able to come together, and maybe they had different views and dissenting views initially, but they could at least come together and say, what do we want to do? What's the problems we want to try and solve? And I think the interesting thing is we've lost these spaces, these venues, these forums, to actually say, look, we know the world is changing. We have different perspectives on it. And in fact, it's good to have different perspectives on it, because if we all think the same thing, we're going to have blind spots. And so one thing I tell my change agents is I want them to disagree with me. I want them to have different views. Bring data. So it's not just your opinion that I'm wrong, but bring data to show why you think you're right. And then talk about why we should invest in an effort. Give me 3 reasons why we should not invest in the effort, because that's actually a good thing too, is think about why we shouldn't do something. And then 3 ways we're going to mitigate how we're actually going to avoid those bad sides of doing an investment effort. So it's almost like the first order, why is it good? But then 2, how are we going to address and mitigate what we want to do going forward?
So David, last week we had Kim Stevenson, who I know you know, CIO of Intel. You two are going head to head for most social CIO in the world. And I asked Kim, what motivates her to blog and speak and, sponsor community events and be active on Twitter daily and be so accessible? What motivates her? I'm going to ask you the same question because, I mentioned Phil Kamani, I mentioned Kim, yourself, extraordinary CIOs, and you all have this common element in your DNA, but I want to understand more what motivates you and fuels your passion, because again, you're an incredible CIO, and our audience would benefit from learning what fuels your passion.
Well, I think probably the simplest explanation I would say is that leadership is passion to improve our world. Now that's high level, but let me actually talk about why that makes me social. Is honestly, when I accepted the mantle of being a CIO, I actually did not expect or actually plan to be a CIO. I parachuted in the FCC only because things were so far behind, things were so bad that they weren't really ready for the future that we needed to get ready for with the Internet of Everything, how that's going to be much more public facing, much more transparent with the public. And so I parachuted in to be a CIO without planning to be one. And when I accepted that mantle of being a CIO, I looked at it and I saw, well, most CIOs aren't having these conversations. Most CIOs aren't actually thinking about organizations. This was back in 2013. The good news is the needle has now shifted. But I actually became social for 2 reasons. One was to blow up that mental image that the CIO is somebody that's in the basement, that is actually not having conversations with leadership, and is actually, stepping outside of expectations. And so it was very intentional about blowing up this mental image of the 1990s CIO that I think we need to do, and that the CIO is much more than that. The second reason why I wanted to be social was I know I was going to miss things. I know I was going to have blind spots. I wasn't going to have all the answers. I think anytime you think you have all the answers in technology, you're probably fooling yourself. And so by being on social media, I was able to meet people like you and Ray, like Phil, several people like Kim, and actually, learn from them, and even more importantly, have a continuous ongoing dialogue about what trends we're seeing, what are the good sides and the bad sides of what's happening with technology, and as a result, also hear from our stakeholders too. And I think the biggest thing about social media that helps you as a leader, whether you're a CIO, CEO, whatever, is it really is about informing you of your blind spots, informing you of the conversations that are happening around you. It's almost like atmospherics, and in some respects, it's just general awareness of what's going on within your community.
So Phil calls that a personal learning network. Is that a fair? I think it's a fabulous way of describing why people like you, Ray, and I mean, Ray is there any analyst, futurist in the world that's more social than Ray? I doubt it. So, and I'm not just saying that because you're a super awesome co-host, but Ray, why do you do it? Why are you, anybody can ask you a question and you respond no matter who they are, and yet you're one of the most respected analysts in the world. So why do you do it?
I'm being put on the spot. I would say, look, there's a passion for sharing, right? I think a lot of folks have been there to help, to teach along the way, and it's just basically paying it forward. And it's also, where you can help, you should help while you're still here, right? I mean, that's one of those things that people don't realize. It's, people around you that are actually, anytime anyone's looking for help, you're just happy to share something, whether it's advice. Now, hopefully it's good advice. Remember, it's free. You get what you pay for, but, we try to give people the best advice at that point in time. And it's that sharing really helps. I mean, that's what makes conferences good when you go to sharing, and it's the conversations in the conference where people are willing to have those conversations, the informal space. I mean, I think the thing you told me, David, that like today on this show that was really important is like, there aren't many safe spaces, and especially DC in such a polarized environment, not just among political parties, but even among departments and different parts of the government. I mean, it's good to be able to have someplace safe to have that conversation. And I think conferences are another place where people have that ability to actually have that kind of informal conversation. But what is scary is in a lot of organizations, it's unsafe to actually have a conversation with your fellow colleagues. And that makes it very, very risky to make this kind of change. And we've seen a lot of organizations.
Yeah, and I would definitely echo that we've lost a lot of safe spaces. I mean, I celebrate that the internet's made us more transparent and open. But I wonder about, is that making it really hard for legacy organizations in either the private sector or the public sector to be more risk-taking? I mean, if you're a startup, you're expected to take risk, you're expected to try and experiment. Hopefully you get a model before your venture capital funds run out, but it's expected it's going to be risky. At the same time, if you're a legacy organization, you've already got a business model that's working. And that business model might actually only work for the next 6 months or 9 months before it gets disrupted, but don't mess it up until that actually gets disrupted. And so it creates this sort of tension where those people that actually want to move the organization forward are almost heretics in a way until things get really, really bad. And so I think we need to actually figure out, how do we have these conversations for either in the private sector or the public sector that says it's okay to say, look, I know it's currently working, but our business model may not work 6 months from now or 9 months from now. And if we don't plan for it now and figure out what's next and actually not just do incremental change, but transformational change, we're either going to go bankrupt or we're going to lose public trust. And that's really what I think social media allows you to have, is those safe spaces right now. But I do worry because, as you may know, I've used this, I think, a couple times. Ensign Nimitz, back in 1904, with the U.S. Navy, ran his boat aground in the Philippines. He was court-martialed, but not drummed out of the Navy. And 35 years later was one of only 2 5-star admirals we ever had that actually was in the Navy and helped us win the war in the Pacific. But that said, nowadays, if there had been an ensign or lieutenant, not only would he have been on Twitter as to fire Nimitz, on Facebook as fire Nimitz, how many news pundits, comedians, and everything like that, and probably called before Congress, and even worse, it's actually now in the Navy. If you run your boat aground, you're out of the Navy. So we may lose a future potential leader that makes a mistake early on in their career, learns from it, and grows. I just worry about, while we become more transparent, are we becoming less tolerant, particularly those in public service, of those that actually take bold risk and move forward.
That's great. That's great story. And I completely agree with you. My final question to you, David, I know you, again, you're actively involved in a lot of communities. I know that you've been watching the discussions at Davos and World Economic Forum. And this discussion this year centered about the 4th Industrial Revolution. And we saw a number of Davos speakers and executives talking about business leaders are afraid, they don't understand, they're somewhat confused about disruptive technologies we've talked about already: mobile, social, data science, cloud, Internet of Things. And as someone who people go to for advice in terms of hard, big, difficult, transformational digital business change initiatives and projects, what advice do you have for CIOs or any business leader watching in terms of what they need to think about in order to survive the 4th Industrial Revolution?
So I think what they really need to think about, if you look at what's going on in the world, and it really looks like history, we're in the midst of living it, but I think when we look back 10 years from now, the trend that is happening is that technologies that used to only be available to large nation states or corporations are now showing up in the hands of individuals. I mean, to wit the fact that we're having this video conference conversation, we couldn't have done this 10 years ago on our own. We would have to go through a commercial provider. So tools and techniques, both in the cyber world, but also now with 3D manufacturing, adaptive manufacturing, increasingly things that were only available to large corporations or nation states are showing up in the hands of individuals. But what's even more interesting is when I was in Taiwan, I saw for $750,000, you could print E. coli from scratch. Custom DNA for $750,000. Now, play out Moore's Law, 10 years from now, that's probably going to be about only $75. And it's going to be a hand of individuals. And so I think the challenge we're facing is it's challenging the notions of what government should do. It's challenging the notions of what corporations can do when it really is in the hand of individuals. And most individuals, hopefully, ideally, will use it either for good purposes or mundane purposes. But we need to really think about also those that may not use it for less than good purposes too. But regardless, all of us need to think about this trend in which we're empowering individuals to do things they've never been able to do before. And by and large, that's benevolent and good. But that also means we all need to be ready to be disrupted. Because if we're not being ready, disrupted, and figure out how we're going to disrupt ourselves, somebody else will. The last thing I actually leave you with too is thinking about the future is much more about just the individual. The future is what I would call either teams or crews, and crews with a K, K-R-E-W-E. Crews are the idea that there's these humans and technology nodes working together. Machine learning, whether it be Cortana, Surrey, IBM Watson, that there's these crews that we actually pull together, humans and machines, and we give them tasks, much like we would right now give an individual. We don't care how they do it, just as long as they get it done. But it's almost like they have a reputation that follows them. And they actually have analytics that can show that if you really want a really good crew at doing transformations, or you want a really good crew at actually tackling this type of assignment, is actually they come together, humans and bots working together. I think that's going to be the future we have to face in the next 5 to 10 years.
Awesome. Awesome. Ray, any final questions from you? Actually, I lied. One more question. David, are you hiring in your organization?
We actually have some things advertised on USA Jobs for government folks. And of course, we also work through our contractor base as well. So there are things also being advertised there as well.
All right. So please, everyone watching, follow Dr. David Bray on Twitter at FCC_CIO to learn more about job opportunities at the FCC, which is fast becoming the most innovative part of government in terms of technology based on the progress you're making. So thank you for that. Ray, you were going to have final comments.
No problem. I was just going to say, hey, if you're in the government and you're starting out, what quick advice would you get someone in terms of being a change agent? And I think that's what a lot of folks are going to want to know, especially given your leadership in the past 6-7 years.
Right. So I think the key for anyone who wants actually to take the mantle is, so I personally look at it as I take the mantle of public service, not just government. And what do I mean by public service? It's really about all of us, members of the public, members of the private sector that care about more than just their own organization, and members that are in the government professional staff working to make a better difference both locally and globally. And so if you accept the mantle of being in a public service, recognize it was designed to be frustrating because we don't want any one person to have too much power. It was designed so that you're going to have to bang your head against the wall. And if you're not banging your head against the wall, you're not creating enough change. That said, find people that are like you, that care about it, find ways of networking with them so you can keep each other sane when you are banging your head against the wall. And most importantly, recognize you're going to feel every emotion on the face of the planet when you take on public service. You're going to feel joy, you're going to feel frustration, you're going to feel sadness. It's one of the most noblest missions. In fact, if you go back to what James Madison said in 1788, what is government but the greatest reflection of humanity? If all men and women were angels, no government would be necessary. You're going to feel every spectrum of emotions, but I guarantee you, you won't be bored, and it's a very worthwhile job.
There you have it. David Bray, Dr. David Bray, thank you so much. And look forward to catching you in the next episodes in the future. So thanks a lot, David.
Thank you, Ray. Thank you, Bob. Always great.
You're awesome. Thank you, sir.